Hey, we're Zane's Father Chris here. Welcome to our Crucifixional Life stream. Glad to have you with us on this glorious Friday. I want to tell you about how things work in my house. Now, before I get into the actual details, keep in mind I am an American, but I'm ethnically Lebanese. So I come from a Middle Eastern Semitic mindset. My family, many of them in past generations, immigrated into the United States from Lebanon, from Jordan, and the mindset that they had, though they acclimated to become Americans, they still had that Semitic mind. Once your mind is formed, it's there. And the reason I say that is because my household, even though I am an American citizen, I live here, I can't help but think that way because that's how I was raised. And what that leaves for us is the following. The house that I live in, it's my house, right? And I say that not selfishly or chauvinistically, but it's in my name, right? Like my name's on the deed, my name's on the mortgage, my money writes the checks to pay the mortgage, right? Like you understand, it's my house. In my house, the beautiful woman that I'm married to, my wife, also resides along with my children. Now, when we sit at the table, it's my table, and my wife is cooking my bread to feed my children when she places it upon my table, right? And this understanding is that as the father, the head of this household, I am the provider, I am the reference, I am the one who gives life to them in the form of bread and shelter and clothing, in the form of teaching, in the form of love, and all of the things that go with that. In my house, again, not to be chauvinistic, you'll see where I'm going. I'm number one in the house, and there's my family. Now, let's just say that it's a holiday and my father steps foot over the threshold of the door. It becomes his house, right? It's now my father's house. It's still in my name and he ain't going to pay the mortgage for me, but he becomes the elder, the father of the household. I become, if he becomes number one, I do not become number two. I become not number one. You see that? So in other words, it's not that, well, if he's here, I'm going to respect my father, but I'm still somewhat in charge. There's the old man and all the rest of us. Now here's where it gets funky, right? This holiday happens that my grandfather also is coming. And he steps foot over the threshold. He becomes number one. My father does not become number two. He becomes not number one, right? So now in a weird twist of irony, my father and I are equal, right? Like I'm always going to defer, I'm always going to respect, but now that the grandfather's in the house, my father and I are the same. And so it's like, hey, so this is the mentality of the idea of the senior, the idea of the Lord, the idea of the master. What Greg was talking about in yesterday's episode was that you are not the reference, right? Like when you're going through or going to sit at the feet of the master, the real challenge becomes that you are not the reference, right? If we take this Semitic understanding of the household and the father and the grandfather, it teaches us how we are supposed to be with God, right? We sit at the feet of the master. In some real sense, he is the old man who crosses the threshold of the house, and we all gather around his table. He becomes number one, and the rest of us become not number one. So in life, in the according to the way that warrior saints are supposed to live and think is that there's God who is the point of reference and all the rest of us who are brothers and sisters. And of course there are distinctions, and of course some are smarter than others or stronger than others or have more things than others. Of course, all of those distinctions are there, but in our minds we have to remember that the reference is never me. The reference is never you. The reference is the master, which is the Lord himself. And as we gather to sit at his feet, which we remember, our text for this week has been, the Mary and Martha text, where Mary is seated at the feet of Jesus listening to his teaching, and Martha gets irritable, and Jesus says, "You're anxious and troubled about many things." Mary has chosen the good part, the good portion, and it will not be taken away from her. This is a message for us that we have to imagine ourselves in some real sense entering the household of our mind, crossing the threshold, but the old man is seated and we gather around, listening, learning from, adopting his instructions and commandments so that we can live our lives in a certain way. Does that make sense? The idea, I know it's very foreign to an American or a Western-minded person, simply because in the West we have a different system about which authority and all the rest of that works. Scripture, however, warrior saints, however, must adopt this Semitic mindset, because it takes you and I off of equal footing and equal plane with God, and it puts us back where he's God, and only he's God, and there's the rest of us. This is important, because as you are trying to live your life as a warrior saint, we have to find a reference point, a teaching, a commandment, a law, a rule, a guidance, whatever you want to say, about how we live. Like, what's the point which we measure what we do, what we think, what we say? What do we measure it against? That reference cannot come from within us, because if it does, it's only going to be as good as we are. But if that reference comes from God, then you know it is on solid footing. You know it is solid ground. You know that it is transformative. It's life-changing. It's life-giving. It is the way that goes through the darkness and through the chaos into life, both in this life and, God willing, in the life which is to come after our deaths. It's so important that we remember that. So as we reposition in our minds, and you got to remind yourself every day that you're not the reference, but that God is, we find ourselves confronted with a new possibility of life. But sometimes, I'm not really sure how to implement all that, or even what God is trying to say to us. What is Christ trying to say to us as we sit at his feet? When you get to that point, when you have gone through the process where you're like asking that question, that's when you go here. That's when you go to warriorsaints.org. All that we do, everything that we do every single day, whether it's live streaming or at our site, is to teach those commandments, to teach the instructions of God, which is ultimately crucifixional, so that we might find transformation in our own lives. I invite you, click 3 steps, pretty simple. Click this website or type it into your browser. Go there. Number 2, subscribe to the Way of the Warrior Saint. This is our course that teaches all of the crucifixional life. Number 3, watch the videos and change your world. It is what it is. It's pretty simple. Visit, subscribe, watch. You're in. That's all we need. We love you, beautiful people. We'll be back Sunday with Orthros and Liturgy at 9 and 10 a.m. respectively, Mountain Standard Time. And of course, Monday, we have a fun week coming up next week. We're going to talk about forgiveness. Love you. Have a great weekend. And as always, keep walking on the way of the warrior saint.